So I want to talk what's been in the news in the last 24 hours, which is superannuation, which you'll all no doubt be familiar with. And really what we're seeing here is the major parties all dancing around, still refusing to deal with what was the biggest election bribe New Zealand has ever seen back in 1975 with Robert Muldoon, which basically promised my generation and yours that you could have this pension, unearned pension, because basically we deserved it. Essentially, when we get older, we deserve to be looked after. But what Muldoon didn't do, and Peters still refuses to do it, is that he didn't look at the demographics of the country in terms of the numbers of people in the different age groups. And it's pretty obvious when you do that the baby boomers, those born between 1944 and 64, so I'm smack in the middle of that, just the sheer numbers of us coming over the hill into retirement puts a pretty big load on the generations behind us, because there's not as many of them as there is of us. So the cost per taxpayer, because remember your super today is paid by the taxpayers of today. There's no pot sitting out the back that they're drawing on. It's coming from incomes and taxes paid this week. And there's just fewer of those people. And so as I come down the hill, they're just going to creak and groan over this. And so the actual amount of money that is being soaked up by super, which means it's being denied other things, like early childhood education would be an example of that. Addressing poverty properly would be another example, is horrific. We have to do something about this because it was a con job. Muldoon was a con artist, and so is Peters. Peters says this is all going to be fine because the economy is going to grow. He's wrong, because New Zealand super is indexed to wages, and wages form the bulk of the income. So as the income grows, so does the super bill per person. And then we've got the extra number of people, me, coming. So it is completely unfundable. Now the issue then is, what are the orthodox parties doing about it? So yesterday we had Mr. English saying, well, I'm not Mr. Key, so I'm going to really come in and deal with this. So he's put in a policy to actually start phasing the age out to 67, which will not take effect until I'm 76. So it's a policy you have when you're not having a policy. You remember that saying? It's a Clayton's policy. It's not a policy at all. But National have learnt this new technique, and they've done it on a couple of other things lately. One was Pest Free New Zealand 2050, and Swimmable Rivers when's that, Jeff? 2040. And that is, you don't do anything, but you announce a policy for some future government. And then everybody feels it's being dealt to. It's another con job. They're not actually doing anything. Meanwhile, on the other side with Labour, who did want to move to 67, but abandoned that policy because Grey Power and that were voting against them. And remember, these guys are career politicians. They just want their jobs. So they abandoned that policy that Mr. English has now announced. And so Andrew Little is now opposing what he was promoting. The world is crazy here. You know, you've got one party doing nothing, another party denying that its policy is actually better than not having a policy, and a third party saying, well, it's all going to be fine. They are all wrong. They just don't have the guts to deal with this because of the voter numbers. Because they almost treat us like children. That in other words, we only vote on our self-interest. And we have no interest in the generations that follow. In other words, our children and our grandchildren. I don't actually think that's right. I think there's a fair chunk of us who are older now who have an intense interest in the world that we're leaving our grandchildren in particular. And so what I am saying is we actually have to deal with superannuation now. Not in 40 years, 30 years, whatever it is, now. And the obvious thing to me, the way to deal with it, because it is a big benefit in terms of the other benefits, by far the most generous, is essentially to say, well, let's bring it down to the average level of benefits, but then let's make available a top-up to what it is today, so you can get that as long as you need it. Remember in the old days we used to have income testing and means testing? That will just cut that bill in half. I mean, Joanne and I are about to get whatever it is, nearly 40 grand a year next year from this thing. All that's going to do for us is just pay for another motorcycle trip around the world. Thanks very much. Meanwhile, you know, we've got blimmin' young mums and that can't even afford to go across town on a bus because, you know, I'm going to have my gold card, I'm fine. Pull up the ladder jack. We actually have to tell these politicians that they're wrong, that we're not driven purely by self-interest, and that we do have, you know, an interest in the life of our kids.